Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 390. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about castles and fairy forts and a tomb older than the pyramids as we go back to Ireland.
I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We don't have a sponsor for this week's episode, but I do want to thank two companies that helped me in my recent tour of Ireland. The first one is Homestay. Homestay.com does homestays that are paid homestays within someone's home. And Homestay.com gave me a 3-day stay with Liz and Mick. And honestly, I think we may be lifelong friends. So it really was a wonderful experience. And I looked, and in Dublin, the cost of a homestay is typically in the range of, say, 25 to 40 or 50 euros, but that's per room, so that might be 1 to 3 people. Pretty good deal, and then you also get to meet some of the locals. I also want to thank dawntodusk.ie, which does photo tours in Dublin, and I did 2 photo tours with them, a night photo tour, and then also one that I would particularly recommend, which is a photo tour down to the south coast. And you'll be seeing some pictures on the Amateur Traveler and a blog post about both of those companies. Before we get into talking about Ireland today, I have 3 news stories for you. In the UK, 2 pilots turned in themselves because they had both fallen asleep mid-flight. One was supposed to be taking a nap while the other one stayed awake. They turned themselves in to bring attention to the problem of pilot fatigue, that pilots are taking on too many shifts. That's a story I'm sure we'll hear more about. And then for those of you who are outside the U.S., you may not have heard, but the U.S. government has shut down right now, and there was an uplifting story coming out of Washington, D.C. Shutdown has obviously affected tourism in the city, and one man decided that he was going to mow the lawn around the Lincoln Memorial because he thought it needed to be done, and there was no money to do it. So he got his old lawnmower and leaf blower and went to work making the lawn nice, and then, of course, was asked to stop by the park police. And it was so close to a heartwarming story at that point. If you're missing a 9-year-old boy, we found an extra one. A 9-year-old traveled on his own and apparently without a ticket boarded a plane to Las Vegas. I don't know how he got through security, and I don't know how he got on the plane. The flight attendants did notice he was on his own, and so by the time that the flight arrived in Las Vegas, he was turned over to Child Protective Services. For a list of all three of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. We don't have a guest this week, but I want to tell you about a trip that I recently took to Ireland. This is going to be the fourth show that we've done on Ireland, but much to my surprise, the places that we went for our trip, we did a road trip to the west, all of the places except for Galway and then Dublin where we started and ended, we haven't covered on the Amateur Traveler. So I'm not going to talk quite as much about Dublin, and I actually didn't see much of Galway, so I'm not going to talk about Galway either. But we did a road trip where we started in Dublin. We went to Kilkenny, the Rock of Cashel, the Dingle Peninsula, the Cliffs of Moher, the Burren. My travel companions also then saw Galway, and then we came back to Dublin. And while that took us all the way across the country and back, we did that all in about 8 days. So really, Ireland is not a big country, so you can really see quite a lot in 1 week. So the one thing I should say first is that this is a fairly easy trip to do, even though you do have to drive on the left, and usually you have to rent a standard car and shift with your left hand, and that's probably even a little more intimidating. You have to drive a lot of roundabouts, but it's not as hard as you would think. This from the guy who was driving the automatic while his friend in the other car was driving the standard. But a couple things you should know. One is that we usually use our credit card to pay for the collision damage waiver, so we don't normally get insurance, and Visa card won't pay collision damage waiver in a few countries. Ireland, Israel, and Jamaica are three of them. And so we did have to pay the collision damage waiver, even though, as I mentioned last week, carrentals.co.uk did contribute the use of both cars. And I won't get into all the details because I did write a recent blog post at Amateur Traveler on driving in Ireland. But the roads do get very narrow as you get away from the cities and out into the countryside. You get to roads where there really isn't room for two cars, but two cars are trying to pass each other. So that's probably why Visa wasn't interested in the damage waiver, and something to be aware of. So the smallest car you can get away with is probably a good idea. The other thing I would say is I got off a plane on Friday night and we started driving on Saturday, so I'd had a good night's sleep. My friend who was in the other car, because there were 8 of us, got off a plane on Saturday morning and started driving on Saturday morning, and so that's going to be a little more challenging. And that's one of the reasons that we did Kilkenny. If you are going to do something like that, Kilkenny is just about an hour and a half from Dublin, so not that far to go, and an interesting city. It's the first of the cities that we stopped at, and we stopped at Kilkenny because it is a medieval city. It still has quite a lot that's left over from there. We managed to get there in time for the last walking tour from the visitor center at 3 p.m. The visitor center itself is an interesting building because it's set in an old almshouse. This is where one of the rich people in town, in order to help save his immortal soul, would take care of a number of men and women who were poor in this house. And the walking tour was fabulous. I recommend walking tours. This was not a free walking tour as we would do later on in Dublin, but definitely worth the money and filled with stories. Filled with stories, for instance, about Kilkenny being the site for the first witch trial in Europe, a dubious distinction for sure, for a woman whose husbands had died mysteriously. Probably she was poisoning them rather than using any particular witchcraft. But it wasn't her that was tried, it was her servant, because she had fled. And they did put her servant in a spitting cage, and that was a new one on me, where they would put her in a cage where people could come by and spit on her to show their disapproval for witchcraft. Like almost every day we were there, it rained some in Kilkenny. Ireland is a very green country, and so really you don't want to walk very far from the car without having a coat or an umbrella with you, because just plan on the weather changing and having just a little rain, not the whole day necessarily. The next day we drove to the Rock of Cashel. And the Rock of Cashel was one of my favorite stops on the trip. As you drive up to this rock, it's a large limestone rock set out in the middle of the plains that has great views of the surrounding countryside and was obviously a defensive point. Early Irish kings put a fortress and a castle up on top of this rock, and later on it was given to the church after the conversion of the Irish. In fact, Patrick visited the Rock of Cashel for a while. And now you'll find the ruins of a cathedral on top of the rock, and also just off to the side you'll see the ruins of a Cistercian monastery, which we also went over to. The Cistercians, or the White Monks as they were called, came over from France. They were called the White Monks because they wore robes of undyed wool. But both of those were wonderful to explore, lots of old Irish crosses outside the cathedral. And interestingly enough, some of them aren't as old as you would think, but they're so weathered and lichen is growing over them that you'd think they were thousands of years old. And yet some of them are only from the 1940s. So definitely recommend the Rock of Cashel. We spent more time exploring the place than we'd originally planned because we so enjoyed it. We drove from there to Dingle, and Dingle is a town near the end of the Dingle Peninsula. And the Dingle Peninsula is an alternative to the Ring of Kerry that we talked about in a previous episode of The Amateur Traveler. Both of them have a lot of old historic sites. The Ring of Kerry gets a lot more tour buses, and so Rick Steves popularized the Dingle Peninsula as an alternative to that. And so while the Ring of Kerry will take you all day, the Dingle Peninsula has a road that will take you maybe 2.5 hours to explore. And the kind of things you'll see along that route are ring forts. And one of the reasons why there are so many ring forts that are still preserved or that are still even unexcavated in Ireland is because of their circular nature. The superstitious belief was that they were fairy forts, and so that's the other term that you'll hear for them. And these are basically fortified farms, really. So there's a circular rock wall around them. One of the best preserved one is in the Dingle area, is falling into the sea, but other than that, is very well preserved. And the rock wall may be only 20 feet across, 30, 40 feet across, depending on how big it is, and maybe 6 to 10 feet tall. And most of these are from the Iron Age, and so they're from maybe around the 800s or so. And the fact that you needed to live in a fortified place, it showed you how dangerous Ireland was at the time. There's also a couple different famine huts on the Dingle Peninsula that are a monument to the potato famine. So the famine of 1840, the population of Ireland in 1840 was 8 million people, and the population today, not counting Northern Ireland, is only 4. Really, the population has never recovered from that famine because of the death and the emigration that it led to. It's a rather small site, but they have interpretive plaques that tell you about the potato famine, or really the potato blight and the famine. The Irish would say that the blight ruined the potatoes and the English brought the famine because the Irish tenant farmers still had to pay their cash crops out to the English to pay for the land, and so they couldn't use that to buy food after the potatoes failed. But the potato was 60% of their diet, so that was not going to turn out very well. We saw a church also, which is an entirely stone church, no mortar at all, which is called the Galrus Oratory, and that was probably a chapel from an early monastery out in this remote part of Ireland. Not a very big building, but with thick stone tapered walls. It's sort of a stone A-frame kind of building. And near there we saw the ruins of another monastery where they had excavated the various walls, and we had the monastery completely to ourselves. In addition to that, the landscape itself is something that's worth seeing. It's a very beautiful area, very rugged area. Not a lot grows out there besides potatoes. You have a lot of sheep in the area because the land is good for that. And you can do what we did, which is go to one particular point, which is the furthest west point in Europe. So we got out of the car and we walked to the edge of Europe. So that was kind of fun to do, and a very, very rugged and beautiful area. We had originally talked about spending more time in the south or in the west, either doing the Ring of Kerry in addition, or going down to Cork or Waterford or one of those places, but we really wanted to see 3 things that were further north, and so we drove from Dingle north, and the first thing that we really wanted to see was the Cliffs of Moher. And that's Moher, and the Cliffs of Moher are these very rugged limestone cliffs on the western edge of Ireland. One of the things that will surprise you if you, like me, are used to the litigious nature of the U.S. is that on this place where you're standing by sheer cliffs, there's kind of an official place that you can go to, and then there's additional walks in both directions from the main viewing area. And at least when you walk, for instance, to the north from there, there's really nothing that keeps you from walking right up to the edge of the cliff or walking off the cliff. There are suicide prevention signs there, but also a number of people, I'm told, every year think that the cliffs are more stable than they are, and so they fall off the cliff, or the cliff falls off with them. And if you look at some of the pictures that I have, you'll see people standing what to me was way, way too close to the abyss, as it were. And even people who are leaning out with someone holding on to their jacket as they go to look down. And that is something that I really just can't do. My acrophobia starts to kick in right around that point. So I was able to lie down and put my camera over the edge, but that was probably about as close as I was getting. But spectacular area, the cliffs there, a couple different watchtowers. One of the watchtowers was really built sort of for tourism, but the other one, way at the edge of the point of the cliffs of Moher, was built by the English to protect against the Spanish Armada. So that was a few years ago. Probably the most memorable experience for me of the Cliffs of Moher, which you may not have, is that's where I learned that my daughter's boyfriend was planning on proposing during this trip. And in fact, he did later on when we were in Dublin. So that spot will be memorable for a couple different reasons. And I said we spent more time at the Rock of Cashel than we expected. We did the same thing in Dingle. We did the same thing in the Cliffs of Moher. Really, all three of those spectacular and dramatic spots. And one of the reasons you really need to go to Western Ireland. Loved Dublin, loved hanging out in pubs, but some of the scenery in Western Ireland is really spectacular. And I'll put a link in the show notes to all of the pictures. I don't know how many pictures I took. We went from there to an area called the Burren, and the Burren has a reputation of being a very barren part of Ireland. In fact, back when the English Protestants were rampaging through Ireland in the 1600s, one of Oliver Cromwell's men, Edmund Ludlow, said about the Burren, "It's a country where there is not enough water to drown a man, wood enough to hang one, nor earth enough to bury him." Now, having heard that description, as we first drove into the Burren, we stopped at the Burren Center, where you can learn about the area and where they also have an assortment of Celtic crosses, of old Celtic crosses on display in a nearby churchyard. But as we drove in from that town, I kept waiting to see, well, where is it going to be barren? Because everything I was seeing, there was grass everywhere. And in fact, we drove through more ring forts in an area with one of the best preserved ring forts in all of Ireland, or best excavated ring forts. And in an area where we were told that at one point there was a ring fort for every square kilometer. But in this area, I wouldn't call it barren. There's grass everywhere, and you can still graze your sheep there. For somebody who's been to the American Southwest, this is not what I would describe as barren. But we did finally get to the area where it's basically solid rock, except that the water has carved channels every maybe 6 inches or so, dividing up the rock into square pattern where grass is still growing in those areas, but it's a very striking landscape from that point of view. And one of the reasons we drove into that area is there is a particular portal tomb. There's a tomb there that is older than the pyramids. It goes back at least to 2900 BC. They're not quite sure of the dating of it. And when I say a portal tomb, this is an area that is standing up like a table, like basically a stone table. It looks like something out of the first book of the Chronicles of Narnia, if you're familiar with that. But as somebody who likes history, we were struck by how old this was, and one of the oldest things that we have seen outside of cave paintings. And those are the main sites that we saw. The family and friends I was traveling with, as I say, went on to see Galway and really enjoyed seeing that. I actually went back to Dublin because I was speaking at a conference. The TBEX conference was in Dublin this year. They did the walking tour of Galway, and then we also did the free walking tour of Dublin. A number of cities in Europe have these free walking tours, which are just fabulous. And when I say free, they don't cost you anything, although you are encouraged to contribute because it is how the guides make their living. Or if you have a group of 10 people, I think you can pay €10 to get your own private tour. And so somewhere in that range is what you think about doing. But for a maybe 2.5 hour, 3 hour walking tour of a city, that's really a pretty good deal. And the guides just have a lot of information, a lot of stories about the different town, about the characters that make up the town and the history that created it. In the case of Dublin, the walking tour really centered around the whole quest for Irish independence. First from the Vikings, since Dublin is a Viking city, and then from the English after the time of the Norman invasion. About 100 years after the Normans took over England, they also took over Ireland. And all of the failed different attempts, and then finally the success they had in 1922, I believe it is. So that being said, the other things that are notable about Ireland, this being my first trip to Ireland, we ate in pubs quite a lot, and because that is in many places the only source of food. There really aren't a lot of restaurants that aren't pubs, and also because in many places the food was very good. It was actually worth trying. Many of the pubs just had your usual pub grub, things like bangers and mash, and then some of them actually had very interesting food that I wouldn't have expected, like warm goat cheese salad and things like that were a little more fancy, even though we're out in a pub way off in a small town by the Cliffs of Moher, listening to traditional Irish music and pulling up a pint of Guinness, or in my case, a pint of Bomer's, which is a hard cider, which is very popular there and a great alternative to a non-beer drinker like me. It's funny the little things you notice when you go back to Europe, like that it's interesting that every drink, every beer, every cider has its own glass with its own label on it, so you can tell who's drinking what just by looking around. Of course, now that I'm back, even after being there just a week and a half, it's odd that I went into a restaurant tonight and I finished my deal and immediately the waitress showed up with the bill, because that would never happen, of course, in Europe. And particularly in the Irish pubs, you really do have the table for a night. And there really is a non-rushed feel for the meals in general, and a general family atmosphere, a lot of the pubs. And it's great that they are now non-smoking, which they weren't when we first went over to Europe. And the people were not only friendly, but also great to talk to. The Irish have a reputation for their crack, C-R-A-I-C, for their conversation. And I found that, for instance, even when I took cabs twice in Dublin because I was going to speak at another event. And so they picked me up in a cab, and it's about a 15-minute cab ride. And the cab ride, I was learning about Irish history and economics. We were talking about travel, and really doesn't seem to take any effort to strike up a conversation in Ireland. And I think one of the things that made the driving probably not as bad as I was afraid of was that people do seem to be in general less hurried, and therefore also a little less hurried on the roads as well. And that's something that was particularly helpful. Although I would say that we did some driving at night as we were spending more time at different places than we'd planned. And driving at night in those roads with a brick wall on your left-hand side that is only a foot or two away with a little shrubbery between you and that wasn't something that I particularly enjoyed, and something I think we would try to avoid in the future. Now, I usually ask my guests for specific recommendations about restaurants. For instance, there are 1,000 different pubs in Dublin alone, but let me give you 3 pubs that we went to that stand out for me. First of all, the pub that I mentioned with the warm goat cheese salad way out in Dublin near the Cliffs of Moher was O'Connor's. Very good traditional Irish music going on at the same time. And then 2 that I enjoyed in Dublin. One was the Odeon, and we had a party at the Odeon. Expedia had a party there, and the thing I liked about it was the atmosphere. It's an old train station, but it actually looks like an old library. And so I just love the ambiance of that. And the ambiance of a lot of these different pubs with the dark woods and things like that were great. And the other one that was interesting, it's more of a bar restaurant than a pub, and that's the church, and it's the old St. Mary's Church in Dublin. There are a lot of abandoned churches because of the drop in population. There isn't the need for as many churches as there used to be, and so they've been turned into a number of different things, and some just abandoned. But this one had been redone into a restaurant. It was very interesting looking. In terms of what the guidebooks recommend that I may or may not recommend is the Book of Kells. There are different schools of thought about seeing the Book of Kells in Dublin. I did see it and did enjoy it. Other people might find it a little expensive for the actual experience of seeing the Book of Kells, because you'll get to see 4 pages of this illuminated text, which is the 4 Gospels written in the Dark Ages. You'll also get to see a couple other books that are contemporaries with that. But all told, you're still looking at roughly 8 pages. But I did enjoy it because I took the time, as I heard, to read the exhibit ahead of time to know what I was seeing. And then also I enjoyed seeing the Trinity College Library, which is the library that they used for the Jedi Library in the more recent Star Wars movies. But a very beautiful library, and that's part of the same ticket. If you're a fan of this show or of podcasts in general, I would also recommend, if you go to Dublin, then go to the Visit Dublin site, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes, but they have Dublin walking tour podcasts, and I listened to those, and that was useful. They overlap with one another, and so you don't necessarily have to listen to all of them, but the one they had, for instance, about Viking Dublin, I found particularly interesting, and it told you interesting things like there is a building there that is built by Lever Brothers, the soap manufacturer, and they have murals in the facade, and this is a very old building. The murals look to be enameled tile, and they depict the use of soap, trying to get people to understand why that might be useful. That's how old that is. The other thing that surprised me was the ubiquity of Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi I had heard was more available there than I'm used to, and one of the things that was handy for me when I had time to kill but I needed to check my email is I had a bus pass that would cover the use of any bus, as well as the hop-on, hop-off bus tour, which I did around Dublin, as well as the Airlink bus to the airport. That's good for 3 days. But when I needed to check my email, I just hopped on one of the buses, because the city buses often have Wi-Fi, not always working, but I would just ride the bus to nowhere, and when I finished checking my email, I'd cross the street, get back on the bus, and ride it back into town. And I should ask myself the same questions I ask my guests. I'm standing in the most beautiful spot. Where am I standing? What am I looking at? I would say the Cliffs of Moher. Just really spectacular spot. One thing that makes me laugh and say only in Ireland, the sense of humor, especially some of the rhymes. I think of the statue of Molly Malone in Dublin, and the statue is wearing a rather low-cut dress, and so she's known as the Tart with the Cart. There's another statue of Justice in Dublin Castle, and I don't remember the rhyming couplet, but the Irish did notice that the statue faced into the courts, and so they pointed out that she had her face to the courts and her ass to the nation. You really know you're in Ireland when what? It's raining outside, but you don't care because you've got a pint, you're sitting in a pub, and you're listening to some great music. If I had to summarize Ireland in 3 words, what 3 words would I use? Green, crack, C-R-A-I-C, the convivial conversation of the Irish, and old. I just can't get over things like 2,900-year-old tombs. In news from the community, I heard from Brian about the episode about Shikoku, Japan. Great work by you and Dan. Perfect balance between a well-trodden destination, Japan, and a new frontier to travelers, Shikoku. Keep it up. Well, thanks, Brian. And then Barry had this to say about the show that we did about Vienna. Hi, Chris and Gerhard. Episode 384 brought back wonderful memories of the trip my daughter and I made to Vienna a few years ago. We stopped in Vienna for 3 days while we were traveling by rail from a conference in Slovakia to Venice. We greatly enjoyed many of the major palaces and museums Gerhard mentioned in the podcast. We also had a few other experiences we thought you and your listeners might find worthwhile. We loved the classical art in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, Fine Art Museum, but we also found the works of Gustav Klimt to be very exciting. 2 museums featuring the works of Klimt we enjoyed greatly were the Secession Building, which features Klimt's famous Beethoven frieze, and the Österreichische Galerie Belvedere, which is home to his famous work, The Kiss. Vienna is the home of the artist and architect Friedensreich Hundertswasser. His style is very reminiscent of Antoni Gaudi. His work can be found throughout the city. The Kunsthauswein is a museum dedicated to his work that we greatly enjoyed and was within walking distance of his famous municipal apartment complex, Hundertwasserhaus. And if you think I pronounced those words badly, you should have heard the first take before I edited it. We found the late afternoon cruise we took on the Danube River to be a relaxing break from the city. Other travelers might have mixed reactions to these boat trips, but we definitely enjoyed the Danube Canal and the ride through a canal lock. Of course, a highlight of our visit to Vienna was riding the Wiener Reisenrad Ferris wheel, featured in the movie The Thin Man, in the Prater Amusement Park. In fact, we found the Prater Park itself to be a fun contrast to the historic and cultural sides of the city. Lastly, no visitor to Vienna should leave until you have eaten a piece of the famous dessert Sachertorte. It is advertised at different places throughout the city, but the place to enjoy the original Sachertorte is the Café Sacherwein near the Hotel Sacher. The rich, dark chocolate cake is expensive, but has a taste that you will never forget. Thanks for bringing back such great memories of Vienna, Barry. With that, and before I mutilate any more German words, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have questions or just want to send an email to laugh at how I pronounce things, send that to host@amateurtraveler.com or leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. You can also join the Facebook community or follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.